Hello, Year 2, how are you? And welcome to today's English lesson. Now, over the last few weeks, we have been completing our unit of work on letter writing. And at the end of this unit, we are going to be writing a letter from Florence Nightingale to her family back home. Now, over the last few weeks, we have covered a lot. We have covered adverbs of time. We have looked at exclamation sentences and questions. We have looked at expanded noun phrases and the past progressive tense, and we've also looked at writing in the first person. Now, today, all of this knowledge is going to come together because we are going to be planning our very own letter from Florence Nightingale. So by the end of the lesson, you will have decided, you have planned what you want to write in the different sections of your letter. So what expanded noun phrases do you want to write, and where do you want them in your letter? Which exclamation sentences would you like to include, and where would you like to include them in your letter? Now, you have done all the hard work already because over the last few weeks you have written different adverbs of time, different exclamation sentences, different questions, for example, that you can include in your letter. But now you just need to pick your favourites and decide exactly where in your letter you want to include them. Now, before we start planning our letter, as I said, we've covered a lot over the last few weeks. So I want to see how much you can remember from what we have covered. So here you have a picture of a swan. Now you're going to be writing 4 sentences and there is an instruction for each sentence. In your first sentence, you need to include an expanded noun phrase. So can you remember what is included in an expanded noun phrase? Then in your second sentence, you need to write an exclamation sentence starting with what. Remember, an exclamation sentence can start with what or how, but you need to decide after what do you need a noun phrase or an adjective. In your third sentence, you need to write in the past progressive tense. So can you remember the different parts of the past progressive tense? And then your fourth sentence needs to include the subordinating conjunction when. Okay, so pause the video now, Year 2, and have a go at this activity. Okay, so while you were completing the activity, I also completed the activity. And I'm going to share my sentences with you. Now, don't worry if you haven't got the same sentences as me, because there are lots of different sentences that you can write about this picture. Just because they're not the same as mine doesn't mean they're not right. You just need to make sure that you've included all of the different parts that you need. So my first sentence, I needed to include an expanded noun phrase. Now, I know with an expanded noun phrase, I need a determiner, I need 2 adjectives separated by a comma, and I need a noun. So let's see if I've included all of these. So I've written the elegant, graceful swan rests on top of the icy, cold water. So I've got 2 expanded noun phrases in there, haven't I? Well, let's have a look at my first one. So my first one, I use the determiner the. And then I have 2 adjectives, elegant and graceful. And yes, look, I've included the comma in the middle of them. And then I've got my noun swan. Okay, so I've included all the different parts. In my second one, I've also included all of the parts because I've got my determiner the, I've got my 2 adjectives, icy and cold, and then I've got my noun water. Can you check now that you've included all of the parts in your expanded noun phrase? Okay, now my second sentence needed to be an exclamation sentence starting with what, and I needed to decide if I needed a noun phrase or an adjective after what. Well, I wrote, what a beautiful swan it is. So I've got a beautiful swan after what? Is that an adjective or a noun phrase? Yes, it's a noun phrase, isn't it? Because it's got beautiful, which is an adjective, and swan, which is a noun. Okay, my third sentence. Oh, and my second sentence, don't forget, you need an exclamation mark at the end. Right, my third sentence, I needed to write this in the past progressive tense. Now, I remember with the past progressive tense, you need the subject, so who's doing the action. Then you need to be in the past tense, so was or were, depending on the subject. And you also need the verb, which you add the suffix ing to. Okay, so let's see what I came up with. I came up with the swan was swimming elegantly across the lake. So look, the swan is my subject. And then the past tense of to be is was, because I'm talking about the swan. The swan was. And then I've got the verb swim, which I've added the suffix ing to. Now, because swim ends in a single vowel sound, I, and a consonant M, I needed to double the M before adding the suffix ing. And then I've also included an adverb. Can you see? Elegantly. And that describes how the swan was swimming. Okay, so check your past progressive sentence now and check that you've included all of the parts that you need. Okay, now my last sentence needed to include the subordinating conjunction when. Let's have a look what I came up with. So the swan stops swimming when it gets too tired to continue. So when it gets too tired to continue is my subordinate clause, and it starts with the subordinating conjunction when. Okay, now I've put it at the end of this sentence, but remember I could also have written when it gets too tired to continue, the swan stops swimming. So I could have put the subordinate clause at the beginning of my sentence as well. Oh, well done, year two. I'd really like to see all the sentences that you've written for this. So when you send your work to the office, could you also send these 4 sentences so I can see your fantastic sentences and what you've remembered over the last few weeks? Okay, so let's get started on planning our letter. So our letter is going to be written in 4 sections. We're going to have an introduction, a paragraph 1 and a paragraph 2, and then a conclusion. Now, in the introduction, we say the purpose of the letter. So why are we writing the letter? And then in paragraph 1 and 2, we give more information. And then the conclusion is the last comments that we want to say in our letter. So what's the last thing that you want to say to this person before you end your letter? So you are going to be planning your letter on this template. So you'll find this Year 2 English 8th of February resource, okay? And this is what you're going to be planning your letter on. Well, we are going to be looking now at planning the introduction together. So here is a zoomed in version of the introduction box. Now, I know over the last few weeks, we have looked at adverbs of time, questions, exclamation sentences, conjunctions, expanded noun phrases, and the past progressive tense. Now, we are going to plan in a minute which of these I want to include. But before that, I know in the introduction, I must say why I am writing the letter first. So I'm going to write a little sentence about why I'm writing the letter, and then this can be my first sentence in my actual letter. So I want to write, I am writing to let you know of my safe passage to Turkey. So I'm letting you know about my safe journey to Turkey, and you in this sentence is Florence Nightingale's parents. Okay, so I have written my first sentence. I'm writing to let you know of my safe passage to Turkey. So now let's have a look at all the other elements. Well, adverbs of time. What do adverbs of time tell us? Well, adverbs of time tell us when something happens, doesn't it? Now, in my introduction, after I've said why I'm writing the letter, I'm going to describe the journey and when I first arrived in Scutari. Not when I arrive at the hospital, but when I arrive in Scutari. So I haven't seen the hospital yet, so I'm not going to describe that just yet. Well, I know that the journey was long, wasn't it? It took 2 weeks. And it was rather an uncomfortable journey, wasn't it? So I could write the adverbs of time for this paragraph as after 2 long weeks, so maybe after 2 long weeks, we finally arrived in Scutari. Or after a choppy, uncomfortable journey, I was extremely happy to arrive in Scutari. So those are the 2 adverbs of time I think I'm going to use. Okay, what about questions? Well, questions always need to end in a question mark, don't they? But they need to start with a question word. Now, what are my question words? I have how, who, what, where, when, and why. But I can also use my other question starters, which are can or could, would, did. What questions will I want to ask my family? I haven't seen them in a while, have I? And they're my close family. So I want to know how they are probably and what they've been doing. So my 2 questions are going to be, how are you all at home? And what have you been doing since I left? So can you see I've started my questions with how and what, 2 of my question words. And I'm asking all about my family at home because I'm about to tell them all about myself and what I have experienced. So I want to also know how they are and what they've been doing while I've been gone. Maybe I could ask them, are you missing me? Okay, so those are my questions. What about exclamation sentences? Well, I know that exclamation sentences start with what or how, and they end in an exclamation mark. So when they start with what, I then have a noun phrase after it. And when they start with how, I have an adjective. Well, I'm going to be talking about the journey here. And I know the journey was pretty awful, wasn't it? Because of the weather. And Florence Nightingale felt very seasick. So I'm going to write the exclamation sentences. How seasick I felt. I've used the pronoun I there because I am acting as Florence Nightingale. How seasick I felt. So that's starting with how. And then what a long journey it was, because it was 2 weeks, wasn't it? So there you go. There are 2 exclamation sentences that I would like to use in my introduction. Now, what about conjunctions? What subordinating conjunctions have I learned? Well, I've learned when, because, if, after, and before. So I think I'm going to include the sentences. I was so relieved when we finally arrived. So using the subordinating conjunction when. And because the weather was awful, the journey was so uncomfortable. Okay, so that is using the subordinating conjunction because. Okay, and I've used my subordinate clause at the beginning. Now, because it's an informal letter and you're writing to your family, you can use so in your letter. It was so uncomfortable. Okay, so you're writing in a very friendly way, aren't you? Because they're your family. So your letter's going to be very informal. Okay, now expanded noun phrases. Well, I'm going to be describing the journey, aren't I? Well, I know the waves were pretty awful and the weather was pretty awful and the boat was really uncomfortable. So what expanded noun phrases could I come up with? Remember, I need a determiner, 2 adjectives separated by a comma, and a noun. Oh, here we go. A choppy, uncomfortable journey. So I've used that with my adverb of time, haven't I? So I thought I'd take it over to my expanded noun phrases. And then the ferocious, mighty waves. Oh, remember, we learnt the word mighty in our reading lesson the other day. Do you remember what it means? Yes, it means strong and big, doesn't it? So I'm describing the waves as mighty. And again, I've got my determiner there, my 2 adjectives, and my noun. Okay, finally, let me think about the past progressive tense. Well, I think I'd like to include the waves were crashing against the boat because they were, weren't they? The weather was awful. So the waves were crashing. And I've used were because there's more than one wave. And I've added the suffix ing to crash. And then I've got the boat was rocking from side to side. So there you go. I have planned my introduction. What adverbs of time, what questions and exclamation sentences, which conjunctions, which expanded noun phrases, and which past progressive verbs I want to use. Now, I have shown you how to include all of them in one paragraph, but you don't have to include all of them in one paragraph. As long as you've got about 3 of these different elements, so maybe you could have an adverb of time, an exclamation sentence, an expanded noun phrase. As long as you've got 3 of them, I'll be happy, okay? Because sometimes putting all of them in can be a little bit too much. Okay, so now we've planned that together. So you can use that plan if you'd like, or you can add to it as well if you'd like as well.